Everyone, so my name's Jack Snape. I'm analysis manager at Transport for the North, so I look after the analytical team responsible for all of the evidence base underpinning our strategic transport plan. And I'm going to be joined by Mike Costello, who'll introduce himself in a moment. We're going to talk to you about the work we've been doing applying system dynamics and understanding the role of transport connectivity in levelling up the north of England. It's an incredibly topical area of research, and I think it's an area where system dynamics is having a real influence and impact on policy development, both in a regional and a national level of government. And I'll give you some background on that, and hopefully generate some questions. So the presentation is structured in two halves. Mike is going to first talk you through the origins of the model, the system dynamics model that we're applying, because it's been developed by Steer, the consultancy who built that over 15 years ago. Someone called John Swanson, who I think you'll be familiar with. I think he's presented at this conference and similar events in the past. John retired from Steer early this year, and Mike is effectively taken over from him. So Mike's going to give you some background on the development of the model and how it's been applied around the world. And halfway through, I'll take over and I'll talk you through how we're applying it at Transport for the North, a bit about the Transport for the North as an organisation, and our suite of analytical tools, the Northern Economy and Land Use model, of which is one, which is the system dynamics model we're applying. And then I'll talk about its application in the business case for Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is a major infrastructure project in the north of England. I don't know whether Mike's joined us, but at that point I hand over to him. Are you there, Mike?
I can't see him in the attendees list, unfortunately.
Okay. He may be joining at 3.
Sorry, yes, we started a little earlier.
Hi, Jack. Sorry.
Oh, you there, Mike? Great. Hi, Mike. So I just gave the intro. I was about to hand over to you. Are you okay to take over? And I'll guide the slides, but if that's okay, if you just let me know. Yep. Unless you can take over, but I think I'll probably do it. That's probably.
Oh God! If I request control, I think that should.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You should just be able to do it with left and right keys, I think.
Let's try. Brain's not working, Jack. Can I? Yeah. I'll do my best, Chris Whitty then.
Yeah.
Okay, but a quick introduction then. My name is Mike Costello. I work for a company called Steer. We're a consultancy that specialises in cities, infrastructure and transport. My background is, well, my kind of work background is kind of transport modelling. I did Masters in Transport Planning at Leeds Institute for Transport Studies. So I'm very interested in the modelling of transport. But at Steer, we also have this model, which I'm going to talk about. If you want to just go on to the next slide, please, Jack. So so at Steer we have a model called the urban dynamic model, which we abbreviate to the UDM. I just realised, Jack, I changed some of the slides, so I'll just if I falter slightly, it's probably because I changed something on the slide.
If you want to share your screen, Mike, and take over, that's absolutely fine.
Go on then, I will do that then. That's probably better. Okay, I assume we can see. Can you just let me know if you can see that? Okay. Yep. Okay. Right. So the urban dynamic model, or the UDM for short. So it's a simulation of how a region or urban area evolves over time, and how policy changes can impact on the urban form. And it views an urban area as a system with interactions and feedbacks. So it's based on system dynamics, or uses system dynamics, I should say. It simulates the interaction between transport, businesses, population, and land use. It was originally conceived by my now former colleague, John Swanson, who is a member of the System Dynamics Society, so some of you may be familiar with his name. He's now retired, so that's the reason he's a former colleague. But he was conceived by John about 20 years ago, and it was inspired by the ideas of Forrester and his book Urban Dynamics, especially this concept of attractiveness of a location, attractiveness as a location in which to live or do business. There's some major differences though between Forrester's work and the UDM. Some of those main differences are that the modelled area is divided into a large number of zones, each of them stocked with people, houses, businesses, that sort of thing. In the model that Jack's going to talk about a little later on, we have sort of 211 zones in the current iteration. In Forrester's model, there was just 2 zones: the city itself and the outside world. We also have multiple classes of households, people, houses, business sectors, jobs, and the skills required to fill those jobs. One of the major things is we have a detailed representation of transport networks, which is sort of consistent with traditional transport modelling. So it uses hierarchical logic structures for choices of travel mode, route, and willingness to travel at all. And we also represent transport networks, congestion on those networks, and how that feeds back into this concept of attractiveness. In the Forrester model, just for reference, there was kind of an implicit assumption that there was adequate accessibility throughout the whole city. As mentioned, it was developed about 20 years ago. I should realise, I'm on the wrong slide. Let's say where I was up to. So the model is, we use the model to represent kind of long periods of time, sort of between 20 and 40 years. We run the model sort of to create a baseline, and then we run it again with some different inputs such as transport changes or land use changes, that kind of thing, to represent a scenario. Then we compare the scenario to the baseline, and this gives us, we're interested in things like the changes in the number of people employed, where they're employed, changes in travel patterns, and that kind of thing. We run the model. The model's built in Vensim, which I'm assuming you're generally familiar with. But we also have a version which you can access via a web browser, which we use for kind of small instances of the model, which is kind of gamified, I think is the right word, where you can kind of act like a mayor of a town and implement interventions to try and make the town better. There's a URL there on the screen which you can use to, if you want to go and look at the demo version. So moving on, I'm just going to run you through some of the principal dynamics in the model. As I say, the model is divided. The model divides its area into zones, and it tracks how attractive each one of those zones is from 4 points of view. So it's from the point of view of businesses and employers as a place to do business, commercial developers as a place to build new business premises, for households as a place to live, house builders as a place to build housing, and then the quality of transport impacts how all of these link together, so it affects the accessibility of the zones. So I've kind of simplified, hopefully simplified what the model does into kind of three slides, which I'm going to take you through now. So firstly, the concept of household location. So just a quick note about the diagrams. The blue circles represent stocks. The green arrows represent a positive link. So if one end increases, the origin end increases, the other end increases too. The red lines represent a negative link. So if one end increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. So a zone's attractiveness for a household to locate there is driven by the availability of employment, the availability of housing, and how travel costs and the travel costs between the two. So reduced transport costs, lower transport costs, improve the ability of the workforce to find employment, which makes the location more attractive to households. This results in inward migration, which increases the workforce. The opposite is true. If transport costs increase, it decreases the ability of the workforce to find employment, and that will result in outward migration. Household location is also affected by development. It's kind of the arrows down at the bottom. So housing construction, attractiveness of an area to have housing built there is driven by the availability of land, and it says prices on that diagram, but actually we use vacancy rates as a proxy for prices. If there are lots of vacancies, that the model interprets that as being, well, if there are lots of vacancies, that's because people have moved out of the area. So the model interprets that as prices being low, and therefore development, less development occurs, and the opposite is true. If there's high demand for, if vacancies are low, sorry, if vacancies are high, there is higher demand for the housing, and that encourages more construction in the zones if the land is available for development. The other side to that coin is the business location. So the attractiveness of an area for businesses is driven by a business's ability to recruit a workforce to match its skill requirements. So I touched on earlier that businesses have jobs that they need filling. Those jobs have certain skill levels. We usually have about, say, 3 or 4, and the workforce will also have those skill levels. So the model matches people with skills to the jobs that require those skills in kind of a recruitment process. The attractiveness of a business is also driven by suitable premises being available. And actually different businesses will locate in, different businesses have preferences for different types of premises, which we kind of represent in the model. So a manufacturing business will want to be in a manufacturing kind of location, not an office. And businesses also value an accessible pool of customers and suppliers, which are represented by other businesses. So reduced transport costs will improve the ability of employers to recruit and also improve their access to customers and suppliers. And similar to the housing, the availability of premises is driven by construction, which is driven by land, availability of land, and also the vacancy rates, which again uses a proxy for the kind of rental income for those locations, for those premises. And kind of the glue that holds it all together is the transport. So this affects the local economy by providing and changing patterns of accessibility. So for businesses, transport provides access to a workforce, increases the size and skills mix of the pool of potential recruits that are available to it. It provides access to customers and it provides access to suppliers. For households, transport provides access to employment and other services and increases their likelihood of being able to find work. Conversely, all those relationships work in the opposite direction. If transport becomes worse, people find it harder to find work and will move out of an area. Businesses will find it harder to recruit a suitable workforce and will move out of an area. When I say move out of an area, that's kind of move from, say, one zone in the model to a different zone in the model. At the top there, we've got an item called transport investment. So transport investment we represent how transport investment can contribute to economic growth. through its ability to improve the ability of employees to recruit, improve residents' access to employment, and improve those business-to-business connections. However, there's kind of a feedback loop there as congestion and crowd on the transport system, as more workforce move into zones and more businesses arrive in zones due to the attractiveness, that puts more people onto the transport system, which increases crowding and congestion, and sort of increases the transport cost element. So there's kind of a feedback loop there, and that will reduce the attractiveness for businesses and households to locate in certain zones. And putting it all together, this is kind of like see this as an overview of the principal relationships in the model. So just a few notes about how we build and calibrate the model. So when we set the model up, we need to give information about where people live, where businesses are located, and the travel costs between them. So the people element is we want to know about population, households, workforce, and kind of information about the housing stock in the zones. For businesses, we want to know the number of businesses, number of jobs they have available, how many people they employ, and what sort of skill levels they require to fill those jobs. The majority, if not all of that information, comes from publicly available sources. So, for example, the NOMIS website, ONS data, census, that kind of thing. The travel costs data can have a number of sources. We can use sort of GIS tools, things like TomTom data sets, which can give us transport costs, or we can use some more traditional transport models which organisations might have available, and that's kind of what we've done with Transport for the North. We then need to calibrate the model, and this step is about setting how people are willing to accept the travel costs between zones, and we do this with what we call deterrence curves. So there's an example on the right hand side there, and this relates the cost of travel between zones to the probability that someone will make a trip. So just on the x-axis, it's what we call the log sum, which is a way of combining the costs of all transport modes for a particular zone pair, and then the shape of the curve is driven by two parameters we call delta and theta, which will change its steepness or shift it left and right. So we in the calibration process we adjust these deltas and thetas so that we achieve the right number of people traveling between zones, and the right number of people is driven by observed data such as census travel to work data, or perhaps data from other transport models. Once we set up the base year, other things that we need to be able to run the model over the 20, 30, 40 year period are sort of the background growth in population and jobs, the land availability, and also any kind of transport cost changes over time. So, for example, increasing fares, or perhaps a percentage increase in congestion to represent more trips occurring on the transport network. So just finally, from my part, this lists some models that are currently in operation, and also some models that are currently being built. We're actually building a couple of models in the US at the moment, which is, I guess, been an interesting challenge. One of the main things being that some of the data that we take for granted in the UK, for example, the NOMIS website, there isn't necessarily an equivalent to that in the US. It's more what's the word, disaggregated. There's not necessarily one organisation which can provide you all the data that you need. couple of things perhaps note on here is the in the kind of the centre of the Midlands Connect logo, there's a URL underneath that. So the Midlands Connect was an example of one of these online UDMs, which is accessed via a browser, and you can go and access it via that URL if you want to have a look at that. And then the one to the right of that for the Innovate UK is a slightly different implementation. It represents how an urban area will come out of sort of a coronavirus lockdown. So it's more of a short-term simulation of how things will change over the short term, going from lockdown to things fully reopening, or some restrictions still being in place. Brings me to the end of my section, so I'm going to hand over to Jack. Jack, would you like to continue to drive the slides?
I think I can. I'll try requesting control actually. That might work.
Ooh, yeah.
So yeah, I'll start by telling you a bit about Transport for the North. We are a regional transport body, a subnational transport body, and we're the first in England to have received statutory status. So that was an act of Parliament to establish Transport for the North with agreement from all of its constituent authorities. And we're governed by a board of the representatives of the local authorities of the North, including the city region mayors, so people like Andy Burnham and Ben Houchin and Steve Rotherham, Tracy Berry now in West Yorkshire. We work very closely with the local authorities and make sure that the work that we're doing is aligned to their priorities for transport investment and economic development in the region. But we're funded by the Department for Transport, so we work very closely with national partners and make sure that we're acting in a sort of collaborative way where national and local bodies can sort of convene and find a way forward that everyone's in agreement with. And we also work very closely with people at Highways England and Network Rail to make sure we're aligned with their delivery programs. One of the things that Transport for the North is able to do is to develop new modelling and analytical tools that can provide a kind of an economy of scale to local authorities who perhaps haven't had the funding in recent years to invest in these types of tools. So we're trying to develop them at scale, but make them relevant and usable to all of the local authority partners in the region. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. So let's see if I can go to the next slide. Yeah, so Transport for the North has a kind of mission statement, which is for a thriving North where world-class transport supports sustainable economic growth, excellent quality of life and improved opportunities for all. So we're looking at kind of, not just GDP growth, but socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable future where transport is helping that to be realised. So our role as the analytical team is to develop a suite of models and appraisal tools that can examine the impact that transport can have on all of those wide range of outcomes. So that's quite a challenge, and that's meant that we've had to invest quite a lot in new sophisticated modelling tools to help us to answer that question. So what we call this system of tools our analytical framework, and the Northern Economy and Land Use Model, which is the system dynamics tool that Mike referred to earlier, or it's an implementation of Steer's urban dynamic model, is just one part of this framework. So we also have traditional transport models, which are not as dynamic, and that they assume that things like land use are fixed, but they include very detailed representations of the transport network. So we've kind of coupled the system dynamics model, which is part of our tier 1 of the model, our economy and land use modelling system, with these much more detailed traditional transport modelling systems. So, sorry, I've gone to go back one. So we have a detailed rail modelling system, norms, and a detailed highway assignment modelling system, NOHAM. They represent really detailed networks, so road networks and rail networks, Also things like rail stations and access to those rail stations by different modes of transport, so by bus, by walk, by cycle. In addition to that, we also have very detailed representations of where households and businesses locate. So we've developed a lot of this stuff in-house in a kind of Python environment, which we call the Northern Model Integration Tools. And part of the reason for this is we have great data from the census back in 2011, but we need really up-to-date stuff. So we developed a tool that essentially synthesizes together different data sets to give you something equivalent to the census, but for a more up-to-date year. So our current model base year is 2018. So we use things like the National Travel Survey, rail ticket sales data, mobile network data, traffic counts on highway links, and all that kind of thing can be synthesized together to give us a semi-observed base year data set, which can be used to populate the models like the UDM, like NELUM, that Mike mentioned earlier. And then the other aspect that's worth mentioning on the right hand side is the appraisal system. So the modeling tools get you so far in that they simulate what might happen if you were to adjust the transport network. But what you really need for a business case and to decide how to invest is how much we value that impact. So the appraisal system, the main role there is to monetize the impacts in terms of social welfare. So the kind of economic theory that, you know, what benefits people will be willing to pay for, and then to use that to do cost benefit analysis and produce things like benefit cost ratios to allow you to decide what the preferred way forward is for a particular intervention. So I'll talk a little bit about the appraisal tools that we've coupled with NELUM, the system dynamics model. So we test policies. So we have a program of potential transport investments. Most of those are looking at improvements to the network in terms of journey time, capacity. On the public transport network, it could be frequency and interchange improvements or access improvements. There are also land use changes that we can feed in. So quite often when there's an investment in the transport network, there'll be an associated spatial planning intervention. So if you build a brand new railway station in an area that's not well connected, it's very common to have a master planning activity where new land will be made available in the vicinity of that hub. So that acts as an input to the system as well as the transport improvement. You've also got land being cleared and made available for developers. So we would include those interventions as well as the transport interventions, feed those into NELUM, the system dynamics model that Mike described, and then feed that into our appraisal system where we would look at the impact of employment, GVA and development ultimately on social welfare, and the kind of the net gain in social welfare at a UK level that we can use to appraise the schemes. People may be familiar with the Green Book, Treasury's guidance on appraising policy interventions. There's been a big push towards not just looking at the net UK social welfare, but also looking at the local impacts, and that's really important for levelling up. So the great thing about NELUM is that spatial granularity that Mike mentioned. So the fact that we have 211 zones, not only do we look at the net gain at a UK level, but we can also look at which places are benefiting and use that in the kind of strategic and economic narrative for our intervention to decide, is this benefiting the places that really need to be benefited? So a key scheme that's quite high profile that we're using this for is Northern Powerhouse Rail. This is building off the back of HS2, connecting all of the major cities of the north. So in particular, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Hull and Newcastle. But really key is also it's connecting in intermediate places into those big cities. So places like Bradford, Huddersfield, Barnsley, Rotherham, Warrington, places that perhaps will benefit more from that growth that the connections could stimulate, and perhaps have more land available to house that development as well. So it's quite a complex intervention, and it's modelled in a lot of detail in our rail network model, which is why coupling the rail network model to NELUM was really key to representing those interventions accurately and assessing their impact on the economy in all of these towns and cities. Not only do we need to represent the scheme itself, but we need to represent what happens in a do minimum reference case in the run-up. So I mentioned it builds off the back of HS2, so we have to represent HS2 and other improvements that might happen on the network in the intervening years, like TransPennine route upgrade between Manchester and Leeds. So there's a lot of work gone into building the interface to translate the detailed transport model travel costs into NELUM, which is that higher level representation, and doing that for a large number of different representations of the network. So you've got the reference case, and you've got different versions of Northern Powerhouse Rail, because we have to choose exactly how to build this thing, and there are a number of options about how you could connect different towns and cities. So we built a largely automated process to do that translation and give you a suite of different rail networks that you can test in NELUM. So what does it look like when we start to present this? Unfortunately, this is the actual results from the model are quite sensitive, and none of them have been published, so I can't show you any numbers, but I have got some graphs and some maps that have the kind of quantitative numbers taken out. What you can see from this is, I mentioned Northern Powerhouse Rail doesn't just improve the journey times and the capacities and the frequencies between the cities, but also there are a number of new rail stations where you have land unlocked, so existing developments cleared and an opportunity to develop. So somewhere like Bradford, you'll be connecting on the south side of Bradford. There could be an opportunity to completely transform a local economy where there's a lot of light industry and not kind of very economically productive land use. You could build new offices, new flats, new green space around a new railway station that's connected to Manchester and Leeds, and really have a kind of transformative impact on the place. So we when we do that, when we code in the rail journey time improvements, what you see is a big improvement in access to employment. So this map is showing you the sort of darker the green, the higher the increase in access to employment as a result of Northern Powerhouse Rail. So you're seeing really big improvements in Bradford, around Manchester Airport and in Warrington, around Sheffield and Rotherham, around York and Selby, and in Darlington, but also big increases in access to employment in lots of places. So basically, these places are getting access to all of the big cities, to Liverpool, to Manchester, to Leeds, and that's making them much more attractive places to live, and then allow people to access high-earning jobs in those cities. And that there's also developments around those stations, so it can accommodate that growth as the places get more attractive. One of the effects that we see is a relocation of jobs into urban areas. So this is a sort of waterfall chart where you see a big increase in jobs in urban areas, a small reduction in suburban jobs, and a slightly bigger but still quite small decrease in rural jobs. But importantly, we actually see a net impact in jobs. This is because NELUM represents the stock of unemployed people, and as a result of that increased access to jobs, you see people across the region finding it easier to get into work more quickly, and there's a dynamic effect within the labour market that means that you do see a net impact on employment. And so this graph kind of shows you two key ways in which there's a net economic welfare benefit from a scheme like Northern Powerhouse Rail. The first is there is strong evidence of an effect called agglomeration, where the higher the employment density where people work, you see a productivity impact that is over and above what you would expect just from the skill level of the people working in those places. So it's a place-based productivity effect that's directly linked to the employment density, but also the access to that place. It's a kind of effective employment density that can be mediated by the transport network. So if you relocate more people to those very accessible, high employment density city centres, you will see a net productivity impact on the UK economy. That's what the evidence and the theory suggests. So we can quantify that in our appraisal tools using NELUM and use that in a benefit cost ratio. The other side of that is the net impact of employment. So people who were previously in unemployment, actively looking for work, if they go into work, there'll be a net welfare impact in that those people are contributing to the Treasury and through the taxation system. So there's more money to spend on public services as a result of that. So those two are key. They're the key sort of dynamic economic effects that we can model with NELUM and use to appraise different options for Northern Powerhouse Rail. So we've made big steps forward with this model, and it's being used in some really high-profile business cases. But there's lots more that we'd like to do, and it's quite a new technique, and there's I think there's a demand from decision makers in government to keep improving the modelling tool and build confidence in its use. So there's a number of active kind of research questions that we're looking at. So one of the things that this agglomeration theory that a lot of the benefits come from is a lot of it's built on monocentric regions like London, but the north is very polycentric. You have a number of medium-sized cities, all of which are quite close to each other, and they all interact quite a lot, and people kind of live between them, and may move from one job to another. And we need better evidence on how agglomeration works in that sort of polycentric environment. I guess the other key thing that's not mentioned on this slide, but is has become critical in the last 12 months, is how does COVID-19 affect agglomeration and home working? And we know that people have worked relatively successfully remotely for the last year, but in the long run, what does that mean for productivity? Do we still need face-to-face to keep maintaining that there's very knowledge-intensive sectors that have thrived historically in city centres? We don't know yet, so we need to collect data on that and make sure that our analysis is still robust to that kind of question. I mentioned social welfare, so we're quite good at measuring the real economy impacts of things like GDP, land value uplift, house price increases. What that actually translates into people's welfare and well-being is something that is an emerging field and something we're trying to get better at. So, how much people value having a bigger house or better access to green space, how people trade off being in work against being out of work, maybe working shorter hours, working part-time. All of those things have an impact on how you translate real economy impacts into well-being impacts, and we need to kind of feed those things into our appraisal tools as much as we can. Model validation is really important. So Mike talked about the great work Steer have done in developing an approach to validating the transport side of the model. I'd like to do more work at looking at the kind of land market side of the model and perhaps doing validation at using some dynamic time series data, looking at the land market and how people actually move in and out of zones, maybe looking at migration data. We have done a little bit of that, but I think there's space to do more. And then finally, balancing model detail with usability. So we have incrementally made the model slightly more complex, but we really want to avoid making it more and more complex and adding in more and more effects, because it's a very usable model. It runs in about 20 minutes, and that means we can test loads of different transport interventions and also lots of different future scenarios for the population and for households. So keeping that level of usability, those reasonable run times and the understandability, the fact that you can put up a stock and flow diagram on a single slide and kind of understand what's going on, I think is incredibly important. If it got much more complex than that, then decision makers would start to struggle with it. So yeah, that's a tightrope that we continue to walk. So that's it from me. So we talked you through the model build, how it works, how it functions, and how it's being applied at Transport for the North. As Mike mentioned, it's being applied in lots of other really interesting case studies across the world. But I think at TfN we've pushed it and integrated it with our modelling tools, and it's being applied on some really interesting policy questions. So yeah, that's it from me and Mike. Are there any questions?
There's a question from Philip Dixon. How much weight is placed on clean air as a factor, e.g. Sheffield has one of the sootiest railway stations in the UK?
That's a great question. We have just been we've been doing some air quality modelling for Northern Powerhouse Rail in the last couple of months, because part of the scheme is to electrify all of those lines between the cities that where they're not currently electrified. And Hope Valley is a tricky one because it's a national park, but there is an aspiration to do that. So yeah, I think places like Sheffield Station will benefit from some of these investments, and we're developing analytical approaches to valuing that. So there are approaches to valuing the health impacts from reducing air pollution, so improving people's health, and also looking at what types of people will benefit from that, because often what you find is the lowest income people are in the places that are most exposed to air pollution. So using these spatially granular models, you can represent that and show that it's really worthwhile to reduce that air pollution, which really helps with the narrative for the investments.
There's also a comment in the chat that you and Mike may like to have a look at as well.
Let's just have a look. Oh, sorry.
I was trying to bring it up without.
Yes, it regards trade-offs on well-being domains, which is something I was going to ask Jack, just in terms of learning applicability. And you mentioned COVID a couple of times in terms of recovery, but also the sort of wider welfare and using the language of place. Mm-hmm. And what people value. So there's quite a lot of sort of social science around that, as well as sort of quantitative stuff, which would be a challenge. But yeah, I'm quite interested in how there's an overlap between mega transport strategies like this and inequalities, welfare. You mentioned some things that would sort of point towards people who live in poorer areas have more air pollution, which can affect their health, which is all a sort of downward spiral in terms of inequalities. So yeah. Don't know whether you've got a general comment on taking your work in, not necessarily in the level of detail that you have it, but in debate that sort of goes up and out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one thing that I'd comment on that is I did talk quite a lot about the cost benefits analysis and trying to boil everything down to a net economic monetized impact. Obviously that is driven by central government's spending decisions and the need to be able to compare the benefits of a wide range of public policy interventions. But one of the real big steps forward with the Green Book review that happened last year is not only looking at local effects, but also tying your modelling and appraisal to the wider suite of strategic objectives for the scheme. So what we're doing aligned to that is using multi-criteria analysis much more. So I think you can use those sort of social science metrics, different metrics that aren't necessarily about monetized impacts in a multi-criteria framework. So you can assess how much is a scheme pushing you in the right direction on a strategic objective, and kind of rag rate that across those different objectives, and pick the intervention that gives you the best outcomes across all of those different criteria. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there's no other. I'll have a supplementary if there isn't another question coming up on the chat, which I don't think there is, which is you've described your transport for the north, that's a big area, and there's a lot of interrelationships. You've mentioned about rail hubs and Bradford or Manchester Airport or whatever. Is there learning at a very local level, or an applicability of the general sort of paradigm, if you like? So if you're thinking about a market town in North Yorkshire, what like I live in, you know, are there lessons to be learned about putting an extra train station outside a market town and thinking about land use, etc.?
Yeah,
or is that too small?
No, I think that there are, and the modelling tools, in theory, have been designed to be applicable to a range of different transport interventions, not just mega projects between cities. And in fact, Transport for the North has a wider investment programme looking at a range of smaller schemes and looking at how they come together in a big programme, including interventions like, you know, in rural areas as much as in urban areas. So we are applying these tools across that programme, and we're also we're developing ways to share the tools with local authority partners as well. And also investing in research. So we've just been doing a project, midway through a project on the visitor economy, and making sure the modelling tools can represent influxes of people at different times of year. So, you know, if you look at the traffic in Cumbria and North Yorkshire in the summer on a weekend, it can be double, if not more than double, what it is on an average weekday. A lot of these traditional transport modelling tools are developed using average weekday data. So we're trying to look at ways to adjust those seasonal adjustments to capture the extreme congestion that you can get in rural places. And that may help to kind of make more of a case for investment in those places that have perhaps been underinvested in because there hasn't been that evidence in the past. Yeah, and we're working through all the kind of intellectual property and licensing issues around sharing some of these tools with local authorities. But I think we're going to have a way forward in the next 12 months, and that's a key objective for this year.
Okay. There's a question about why Newcastle hasn't benefited in your shading.
Yeah, I mean,
it's Newcastle.
One of the things you find with access to employment, if you're looking at that, is that the metric that I showed with access to employment, you're interested in kind of commute time scales generally, and Newcastle, even under something like Northern Powerhouse Rail, you know, a commute is unlikely to be significantly more than 45 minutes unless you're in the sort of long tail of the distribution. So I think the rail connections for Newcastle down to the rest of the north are much more about business to business connectivity, where people are willing to travel that bit further, and that map that I showed was more about that kind of commute access to employment. So it does benefit in a different way. Perhaps the benefits aren't quite as big as they are for the other places where there's a big labour market impacts. But I think for the businesses in Newcastle, there are some big impacts.
Okay. Great. And there's another question from Nikki. How does your model relate to the London simulator by Greenwood Strategic Advisors, modelling the return of transport investments? And can you add more detail on how you represent the spatial aspects?
So I'm not familiar with that model, and I don't know if Mike is either. But
no, I was just thinking about it. I'm going to look it up though now. But okay. No, I'm not.
So that's a pointer.
Mike, yeah. I've answered a lot of the questions. Did you want to come in on the spatial aspects?
Yeah, so I think if I understand this correctly, I think the answer is that in the model, all the calculations happen at a zone level. So each zone has a stock of workforce, has a stock of businesses, a stock of jobs. So when you have when more people become employed in a particular zone, that the stock in that zone will rise. And in other zones, it will go down. So I mean that allows us to see the results at an individual zone level. In Vensim terms, if you're familiar with Vensim, all the calculations are subscripted on the zone as well as various other things. So yeah, I think the answer is that all the calculations that the model does are done at a zonal level. It's not at a overall level. You can aggregate up, obviously, but everything is available at a zone level or at a zone pair level if you're thinking about transport times.
Right. Okay. There's no other questions in the chat. I've asked my dollop, which is 2 minutes away from the end of this session. So thank you very much, Jack and Mike, stimulating example and much work to sort of continue to develop. And as soon as you said at the start, this is a model that's been in 15, 20 years worth of development. I think the longest model that we've got is probably about 4 or 5 years old and still grows. So if it's still around in 20 years, I'll be pleased. But I can understand how it has an awful lot of detail in it. So thank you very much, Jack and Mike.
Thanks.
Thank you.